Everybody, hi, may I have your attention? Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Like this.
Like this. All right, let's do this. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to COP27. This is the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Council on Energy Environment welcoming you to their brand new panel on Stockholm+50, shifting sustainability from the margins to the mainstreams. We bring to you a landmark report called Stockholm+50, Unlocking a Better Future, prepared for the Stockholm+50 commemoration meeting that was held this year in June. Today's panel will focus on key recommendations of the report as well as the intersections and highlights this has for the global education landscape. We are proud to present to you two interesting panels, one with leading industry and academia, and the other with young people and professionals who are inside the room and not on the protesting lines. My name is Prayang Jain, and I will be your master of ceremony today. With this, I'm pleased to just, before we begin and people start gathering in, I'll give you a quick overview of this whole Stockholm+50 process. For about 8 months, two organizations from the leading South and North, Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and the Stockholm Environment Institute came together to prepare a new vision for the future. A vision that looked at how can we bring transformative change at the scale and pace required across various regimes. And today we will be presenting that report and discussing and highlighting some of its recommendations. With this, I am pleased to invite Dr. Arunabha Ghosh, founder CEO of CEW, to come and share the report. He is one of the lead authors of the report along with Dr. Osa Persson and other colleagues at both institutions. We'll start in about a minute. Before we begin, we have Ms. Karuna Singh from earthday.org who've organized this majestic climate education hub to talk to us about this pavilion and the idea and what Earth Day is doing at COP27. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Oops, you've got something, Priyank. Thank you, Priyank, and thank you to CEEW for coming here today and presenting the report on Stockholm+50. I'm Karuna Singh from earthday.org. Climate education is one of our major focus areas, and on behalf of earthday.org, I welcome you all here. Earth Day is 22nd April every year for the last 52 years, and every year there is a special theme. And this year's theme and next year's theme is Invest in Our Planet. So foundational to investing in anything else is investing in education. So thank you again, Arunava and Priyank, for coming forward to partner with us for this occasion. Thank you all.
Thank you, Karuna. Check. How does this work? Okay. Check. Better if I stood in the middle of the room, then you can see both the screens. Good morning. Priyank said good afternoon. I guess some of us are feeling that way already. But thank you for coming for a session on the Stockholm+50 report at the Climate Education Hub. I can't remember when I went for a Saturday morning class, so I really appreciate all of you joining us in this conversation today, and deep appreciation to all the speakers that we'll have in the panel just after my presentation. So what I'll do right now is just present to you the broad outline and the recommendations that we have in the Stockholm+50 report, and then we'll get into how do we draw on the specific recommendations, particularly from the point of view of the role of the youth, education, and so forth. As Priyank has already mentioned, this was a joint collaboration between the Stockholm Environment Institute and the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We were mandated by the UN Environment Programme and the Swedish government to write the scientific report for the Stockholm+50 conference. Those of you who were not around in 1972 would still recall that it was, in my opinion, the trigger for modern environmentalism. So 50 years on, where are we? And 50 years further, where should we get to? So we started off by recognizing that we are currently in a watershed moment. And that watershed moment is not a very positive one. As you can see from this graphic, only about 1/10 of global environmental and sustainable development targets have been achieved. And of course, we are having this conversation in 2022, exactly halfway between the 2015 to 2030 Sustainable Development Goal agenda. So in many cases, whether it is the environmental dimensions of the SDGs, the Aichi targets, the Millennium Development Goals, other global environmental goals, we assess 34 of them and so forth. In many of them, we see only some progress. Very few have significant progress, and there is, in fact, insufficient data in many other cases as well. But this graphic worries me even more. No country is delivering what its citizens need without breaching the planetary boundaries. On the, I don't know how clearly you can see it, on the vertical axis, we've got the number of social thresholds that have been achieved. It's education, healthcare, and so forth. And on the x-axis, we've got the number of biophysical boundaries that have been transgressed. So of course, from a human development perspective, you want to go up. But in the process, we're also going right. So we are ending up in this high overshoot space. Translated very simply, we're consuming 1.6 planets every year in terms of delivering our development outcomes. So we're drawing down the stock rather than replenishing it. So as all of these countries start moving up there, do they also keep shifting to the right? And if that really happens, what happens to the planet? So having recognized that we are in this watershed moment, we have to then think about how do you fundamentally change the approach that we take towards development. And we offered 3 basic paradigms. The first, redefining our relationship with nature. The second, ensuring that prosperity lasts for all. And third, investing in a better future. So let me just spend a few minutes talking to you a little bit about the recommendations. You can see these little Easter eggs. The most important Easter egg is the biosphere. There is no point trying to achieve our sustainable development goals if we are going to breach the biosphere's boundaries. Within that biosphere is embedded our society, and within that society is embedded our economic system. So when it comes to being consistent with a stable and sustainable biosphere, we had some very clear recommendations, actionable ones. We talked about, in a rapidly urbanizing world, how nature and urban design can come together. We talked about not just human rights and the human right to a sustainable environment, but also the role of animal welfare as a sustainable development issue. We talked, since we are in the education hub, we talked about nature-conscious education curricula in schools and higher education. And we also talked about incorporating traditional knowledge in the processes. We then moved on to ensuring a lasting prosperity for all. That second Easter egg. And that's where, in one word, we got to think of it as a massive growth to circular economy. But it starts only by having sustainable lifestyles. As Gandhi said, the world has enough for everyone's need, not enough for everyone's greed. But while that's a nice sounding quote, what does that really mean? What does that mean in the way we approach this from our social and economic systems? So in October this year, just 4 months after the Stockholm+50 report was launched, Prime Minister Modi and the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres jointly inaugurated the new Mission Lifestyle for Environment, which is currently a national mission in India, but has been designed as a global movement. What does that entail? It entails, of course, nudging individual behavior, but it moves beyond the switching of lights and fans or not drinking water out of plastic bottles to moving towards enabling markets that can drive the circularity in our economies. Whether it's materials, whether it's minerals, whether it's products, whether it's services. So we also talked about moving towards business models that sell services and functions rather than products. We looked at supply chains and much greater due diligence needed for reducing the resource footprint throughout. I served on the Secretary General's high-level expert group for net zero commitments of non-state actors, and we made it very clear in our recommendations this week that it's not sufficient for a company to say they're aiming for net zero if they're not looking at their scope 2 and scope 3 emissions as well. Linked to this whole story around circularity is the potential for decent jobs and livelihoods. In India alone, for instance, there are about 111,000 jobs that have been created in large-scale solar and wind, about 200,000 jobs that have been created in distributed energy. By the end of this decade, we'll have a workforce of 1 million people with full-time equivalent employment for 3.5 million people if we went for the nearly 500 gigawatts of non-fossil electricity capacity. But bulk of those jobs will come from distributed energy. So how do you then create a future that is not only digitalized and decarbonized, but also distributed so that you have more communities that have a livelihoods focus in having a stake in a future economy that is more sustainable? And in order to do that, we also have to build up the data sets, not just from non-state actors, but state actors, our national accounting, which focuses not just on production-based emissions, but consumption-based materials footprints. And that can then drive an investment in a better future. That's the last Easter egg. So we've focused on the role of public R&D to drive mission-based focus on circularity. We've called for a new paradigm of technology co-development. It's 30 years since the UNFCCC was initialed. We've looked at more than 30 climate and technology initiatives. None of them do technology transfer at scale. Many of them talk about it. Some have workshops around it. So if you've got to acknowledge that there's no technology transfer happening, then we need a new paradigm of technology co-development where the big and the small, the rich and the poor, the north and the south, pool resources, not just financial, but human and technical, pool their capabilities to build projects across their geographies, to adapt those technologies to local circumstances, to take joint liability of the emerging technologies, to jointly co-own the intellectual property, to have jointly voice in the governance of those emerging technologies. Only then we can have a future that is sustainable, that narrows rather than widens the technology gap. But you can't do that if you don't have financial de-risking. And again, we've looked at dozens of financial initiatives. Less than 10 of them even mention de-risking. None does de-risking at scale. And yet we keep talking about de-risking and blended finance as if everybody knows what it is, and nobody actually still acts on it. And of course, related to that, we've got to disincentivize unsustainable investing. For the last couple of days, because I've been talking to a lot of businesses with regards to our recommendations, I've been saying we, unfortunately, at COP-like settings, end up creating mutual admiration societies. So everyone goes and announces their new initiatives, and everyone says, oh, wow, what a great initiative. And then we come back the following COP, And we never ask what happened to the initiative you announced last year. We announce new initiatives, and we again have a mutual admiration going on. So we have a slew of initiatives with no incentives to hold people who are announcing the initiatives to account. So in fact, we hold a responsibility to each other as friends and as colleagues to ask each other, hey, you announced something last year. What happened about that? What have we done about it? How can I help? In order to fulfill these three strands of a redefining of relationship with nature, of ensuring a prosperity that lasts for all and investing in that better future, we need enabling conditions. Policy coherence, I don't want to get into details, but I can tell you right now that even if we are all converted, we'll go back to our home countries and we'll see that there are incoherent policies that send mixed signals to states, cities, companies, citizens. We'll need a solidarity-based focus on renewing multilateralism. I just said earlier this morning, the greatest challenge facing humanity is not climate change. It's only the second greatest challenge facing humanity. The greatest challenge facing humanity is a lack of empathy, a lack of understanding of the lived reality of people from other cultures, from other geographies, of other genders. And if we don't walk in the shoes of the vulnerable, we will not be able to renew faith in multilateral processes that then deliver solutions that are oriented towards the most vulnerable. And therefore, we come back to accountability. We propose an accountability summit, not just an ambition summit, not just an implementation COP. And that's not about finger pointing. It is about trying to learn from each other, learn what's missing, learn how we can help, but to hold ourselves accountable rather than keep announcing new initiatives, hold ourselves accountable for what we are announcing. You can read a lot more in the report that we had published, but also alongside that, we surveyed about 1,000 youth from 91 countries across the world to write a youth report on their vision of a just and sustainable future. So since we are talking about the young, I want to end with, and since we are being hosted by Earth Day, I want to end with lines from a poem I wrote on Earth Day in the year that the pandemic struck us when we were all in lockdown, April 2022 in 2020. Sorry, April 22 in 2020. And the lines go like this. What if the stars looked up on Earth? Would they notice a father and daughter giggling as they hiked together, smelling rain, holding pine cones and feathers? Would they know this globe is not his, but hers? I have a 10-year-old. It was written for her. I hope we can do the right thing. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Robert Watt. I am the Communications Director and Head of Strategic Policy Engagement at Stockholm Environment Institute, and I'll be moderating our first panel for you today. It's a real pleasure to be here sharing the stage with CEEW, our collaborators and partners on this project to produce this report, the scientific report for Stockholm+50, which Aranaba has just walked you through. I want to just try and show you a picture from the report itself, just to remind you of the eggs and also these three keys to unlock a sustainable future. We are going to be talking about the role of education, skills, in building that sustainable future. And you can see stretching out from these eggs several strands with key actions. In the report, which you can find on www.stockholm50.report, you can read a number of recommendations And I hope that we'll have an opportunity to discuss some of those recommendations and draw upon the extraordinary wealth of experience we have from our panel, who I now will introduce to you. Can I invite up to the stage, first of all, Kanika Charla, who is Program Manager at UN Energy, Sustainable Energy for All. Welcome. Lisbeth Steer, who is the Executive Director of the Education Commission. My dear friend Philip Asano, who is Centre Director of SEI's Africa Centre. Jessica Omokuti, who is from Oxford University, part of the Oxford Net Zero group, and also a member of the high-level expert group on net zero emissions from non-state actors. I think I've even managed to get that title correct. It's quite a mouthful. And finally, Catherine Bunting-Howarth from the New York Sea Grant. It's a real pleasure to have you all with us today. I'd actually like to start off by asking you just to tell everybody here why education, thought of in as broad a set of terms as possible, skills for the future, education of children, training, how does that relate to the work of your organisation? Why does it matter? And I'm going to start all the way over there, if I may, with Kanika.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you to CEW and SEI for having me here. Why education is important, I think, especially 1 week into this COP, is in fact to resolve some of the roadblocks that we continue to face. For many of us, this is not our first COP, and yet the conversation seems like it has not moved forward at all. And it's because perhaps we aren't bringing new knowledge into it. I think, as Arunabh has said, we are debating some of the same things with the same actors, and we're not bringing new voices into the mix. We're not necessarily bringing new knowledge into the mix, but more importantly, perhaps we're not bringing new types of discipline into resolving what we think is a technical challenge, but maybe it requires us to borrow from other disciplines in order for us to make progress. So at UN Energy and at Sustainable Energy for All, the way that we try and do this is, one, by bringing women more substantively to the forefront. That's a really important part of our work, including skilling them, training them, and integrating their voices, not as a separate stakeholder, but as a deeply integrated stakeholder across everything we do. The exact same thing for youth. When we have one youth day, we make it seem like every other day is not Youth Day. And I think it's important to recognize that, in fact, every day is a day that should be inclusive, and we shouldn't have to earmark this, as much as I recognize the need for affirmative action. And finally, we have a energy compact process that UN Energy runs, which is a voluntary commitment process that is not open just to one type of stakeholder, but really works at the intersection of government as well as private sector and civil society action. And taking a cue from, again, what Arunabh has said, we do hold all of those the proponents of those commitments accountable with an annual stock take. So I'd be happy to talk about that a little bit more also as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kanika. That's a wonderful. You've kicked us off beautifully there, talking about integrating different knowledges, making sure that all of the right people are around the table, deeply engaged all the time. And I'd love to come back on the accountability bit. Lisbeth, over to you, please.
Thank you. Why does education matter? We've heard a lot of very tragic statistics about the state of our planet in the last few days. Underlying that crisis is a human development crisis. And we know that countries with low levels of human development and education are much more affected and much more damaged by the impacts of climate change. We also know that countries with low levels of development will not be able to be part of the solution as they ought to be, because we need education in order to adapt and to decarbonize. So we at the Education Commission have been making the case for investments in human development, but it is a crisis that is silent and it is often forgotten. Today, 70% of the world's young people between the age of 15 and 24 are entering the labor force without basic secondary level literacy and numeracy skills. That's 840 million young people who are today not going to be part of the solution, and they will be affected by climate change. We, at the Commission, we have been trying to frame the intersection between education and climate, because what we have noticed is that we are operating in silos. We have conversations in the education sector, and then we have conversations in the climate sector. And there are three areas where there are clear intersections. One is around how do we change behavior through education. That's about climate literacy and using the education system. The second, which is often kind of forgotten as well, is that any alternative growth path, and we saw this in this great report, any nature-based solution requires skills, and many of the NDCs do not look at skills or do not include education as a component. And the third reason is that in order for us to adapt, we will need to educate. There is no adaptation without education, because the more educated you are, the more able you're flexible and able to redeploy yourself. And there's evidence that low levels of education lead to obviously greater negative consequences. So those are the three reasons why we are interested.
Thank you very much, Lisbeth. That was fantastic. You put some numbers on the reason why, or the fact that there are so many people who are being excluded from being part of the solution, and giving those three specific things that need to change, and pointing out that there's a connection here to policy coherence, which Arunabha explained and is one of the important levers that needs to be addressed and that we raise in our report. I'm going to come back to you on a number of questions that I've got, but before we do so, Philip, over to you. I know that SEI Africa has been doing a lot of work in terms of connecting with young people and listening to them and enabling their voice to be heard. But tell us a little about the education picture from where you sit.
Thank you so much, Rob. I think why education matters, the choices that we make and the decisions that we take are based on the knowledge which we have. And that knowledge is acquired innately as we grow up when you're born. But more fundamentally, that knowledge is acquired through the education system. When you look at the kind of crisis that you're facing, it means that that crisis is caused by decisions that the global community has taken and the action they have taken. And that speaks to a fundamental flaw in the education system. So one solution, of course, is to relook at our education system and find out what is it that would make humanity make choices that would contribute to solving the climate and other environmental crises. But as we do that, I think it's also important to realize that this is not just the formal education system. There's a way of learning that has been acquired by many societies over many generations, which in some quarters you can call indigenous knowledge or local knowledge and so on. And in many instances, this has all that knowledge and experience that has been there with these local communities has kind of been set aside and forgotten. And we probably need to relook at that and say, okay, what kind of these indigenous knowledge systems were there that can actually help inform not just policies, but actually also decisions that we take. But moving to the formal system, I think it's also important that we talk about co-creation of technology. And moving forward, I think we'll have a problem. The house is on fire, so we have to put out the fire first, and then part of putting that out fire is to think about what kind of technologies are we looking for the future. And I mean, for example, within the Stockholm Environment Institute, We just published a report for Africa that looks at how can Africa achieve low carbon emission development pathway. And if I give you an example, we have 37 measures which we recommend for governments. One is on transport system. And we say that one options that African countries might have is actually to position themselves as a new hubs for e-mobility, electric vehicle mobility. Between 2015 and 2018, 40% of export of imports of second-hand vehicles from Europe, Japan, and the United States were to Africa. This cannot be the future because we know these are petrol and diesel cars. And so the future is in the formal system is how do you prepare a technologically driven workforce, mostly young people, that would then be able to bridge this, take forward this e-mobility technological solutions. So that's an example of what kind of change we can make in the education and formal system.
Thank you very much, Philip. Bringing in this perspective of the local community grounded knowledge, really important, and then preparing for the workforce of the future, which needs to be skilled, equipped to be able to perhaps leapfrog this sort of fossil fuel-based system. So really interesting. Let's come back to that. Sort of unpack a little bit what the enablers and barriers might be to some of those things. Over to you, Jessica, please.
Thank you. So at Oxford Net Zero, we work on net zero. We're actually concerned about net zero globally, but we look at how net zero looks like in developing countries and emerging markets. And net zero is not just a thing we hope to achieve in 2050. It's a path we start taking now. And so just transitions are a pathway that we begin implementing today. That means that transitions today will need skills, both for the current generation, but also for future generation that will be in the workforce. And this is where we see education playing a very big role. And so the transition to net zero, based on our work, will need two things. One is skills within the population to develop the technology, low emissions technology, that will drive the transition, but also to deploy it and use it. And second, we need a population that is aware, both in the present but also for future population, that is aware about what investments are going into low emissions technologies, but also the investments that are not. And so these two facets, I think, are very important. And so when you bring them back into education, you see that education is quite important for building the skills, but also for building the awareness that will hold both the government, but also the private sector to account in relation to where the investments go, but also in relation to what those investments achieve. And I'm happy to also talk about that a bit later.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jessica. Catherine.
Yes, so I am from Cornell University. So of course our mission is to educate our young people in a variety of disciplines, whether it's engineering, environment, social sciences, policy. And what we want our students to do is to appreciate the other disciplines. And one of the goals of Cornell University is to have every undergraduate person have an engaged learning experience. What does that mean? Maybe they work with industry to actually practice what they're learning. Maybe they work in a community to do a community-based research. We want our students to be able not only to know the information, but to be able to apply the information. So similarly, Cornell University is our state's land grant and sea grant college. And what that means is that we fund research of relevance to coastal communities or our local communities, and then have a staff of professionals that translates that research and gets it back to the communities. It also serves as a pipeline to bring community research needs back to the university. And so in that role, we also have a responsibility to our teachers for K-12, and we have a responsibility for informal education of children as well as adults. For example, since we're at the climate meeting, we have a new climate stewards program where we work in different counties across the state to train volunteer adults on climate science, climate impacts, climate mitigation, climate communication, how local governments work. And then at the end of their learning, they volunteer for a certain number of hours doing a project for a local government in order to help them achieve their climate goals. And so it's really important that we're not just an education institution or a research institution for a certain age group, but we have responsibilities to our entire community, and that includes our global community.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Really situating the role of the university not just as a place of research excellence, but as a hub for the community and a servant of the community in many ways. You pick up a wonderful example that illustrates, I think, what Lisbeth is talking about in terms of awareness, climate education, but it's very much embedded in the needs and the realities of those local communities. What I'd like to do is actually circle back to one of the things that has come up in pretty much everything here, which is the question of building or training and providing the skills for a workforce that is going to be part of, hopefully, the transformation that's required, but is also going to be affected by many of the transitions in our economies, in our industries. And I would like to, anybody, please just raise your hand if you'd like to answer this. What I'm interested in knowing is, what are those skills? What is the skills gap? And I can see that Kanaka wants the mic, so I shall run over.
Thank you. I think as I heard everyone talking, it is really already quite heartening, the efforts that are underway to reform or add to existing educational mechanisms, right? Whether they are formal or informal, and formal also trying to become more informal, go back to the community. However, what I think is hugely lacking is how do we educate those who are not going into educational institutions because they've already been through formal training? There is no incentive for them to go back to school, or they don't think that they need to change and learn. And one of the things that we were hearing in the slides was, how do you disincentivize climate unfriendly investing? How do you, when society at large or markets at large are rewarding a group of people for doing things a certain way, how do you get them to go back and relearn? And that requires unlearning, relearning, accepting that something has to change. But without that, we're not going to change how this works. I mean, I think one of the things, at least in my personal opinion, that is the largest bottleneck to making climate progress at scale is the flow of capital. And the reason that that doesn't happen is because we don't price risk correctly. We don't have we're myopic when we're making investment decisions. And there is absolutely no incentive for these people to go back to school. And what is this school, right? Where does this retraining happen? And I'd like to maybe, so it's not a response as much a question to the rest of the panelists of how do we fix this?
Brilliant, Kanika. That is a great question. I can see that. I was going to ask Elizabeth to answer. Elizabeth, you talked about the 800 million who are not getting education. But what about the millions who need to be retrained? So they may have an education, but they need retraining. Tell us a little bit how. Try and answer that question.
Well, when you said what is the skills gap, I think the question is what are the skills that are being required, what are needed. And the 840 million that I was talking about are basic numeracy and literacy skills. So we are not yet talking here about advanced technical skills. We are also not talking about soft skills, which are the skills that are often missed. So when people talk about the energy transition, green energy, renewable energy, we'll need people who can deal with solar panels. Yes, that might be the case, but we will actually need a flexible workforce because most people in the world will have several occupations in their lives, and so we need to train people to be able to learn and to be able to problem solve, communicate, collaborate. Those are what we call soft skills. And that is what many organizations also say they need. The problem is we are not measuring those. And so at the moment we don't really know the state of the world's soft skills. So there is a need in the education sector to be much more serious about measuring the different types of skills that are required, going from the basic foundational to the technical to these advanced skills. And I would say when we are in the conversations here, as I think you mentioned, when people discuss the energy transition, there is actually not that much a discussion about what are the skills gaps. And that needs to become part of the measurement as well. I was yesterday also in the System Change Lab launch. This is looking at sort of the transition and all the changes that need to happen in the systems. Well, we need to look at all of these pillars and see what are the critical skills needed and then start measuring them.
Thank you very much, Lisbeth. I would actually like Philip to come in now. So Philip, grab the microphone from Lisbeth. I just want to summarize that. Really interesting points there. Making sure that people are equipped with the soft skills that are sort of, if you like, foundational for a career or a series of jobs, things that you can take with you that are interchangeable. And then the point about we need to measure those, but we also then need to know what the skills gaps are. And there's a bit of a blank space there. But Philip, you gave an example specifically about e-mobility. What do you think the skills gap is if Africa were to become a hub for e-mobility and to thereby avoid the trap of being just simply the dumping ground of the fossil fuel vehicles from Europe? What is the skills gap, and how do you fill it?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. So there are two things. One is the first skills gap is actually the faculty. So if you look at the kind of setup that we are envisioning to create a hub for e-mobility, you'd need a set of faculty that are trained with those particular skills, and most of them would come from engineering. So if you look at our technical, vocational and learning institutions, you therefore need to invest there. At the moment, if you go in any place, not just in Africa, I think even in Asia, the kind of technological approach to their training is still designed in the mindset of the current, infrastructural systems. So that is one. But the second thing is that as you then bring in the new learners, this new generation of learners that are being trained for a low carbon economy, they have to be trained in a transdisciplinary setup. I think our traditional formal way of training is very disciplinary focused, and certainly in many parts of the world is very competition oriented. People go to school and it's about competition, it's about who is the best get rewarded. But it's not about cooperation. How do you promote cooperation? And when we talked about empathy, in a setup where competition is the driving force, kind of the main incentive, there's very little room for building up an empathy system. But I wanted to bring in one thing which I think is important, and I think is a point we are missing. If you talk to any educator, the age between 2 years to about 10, 12 years is a very important age, because that's the point at which you sort of like set up fundamental values for young people who then grow up into different careers, whether they're lawyers, whether they're economists, and whatever. And so the point which we need to invest a lot is at that early age, we need to expose early learners to respect nature. So when we talk about reconnecting with nature, a system of education which does not help learners appreciate nature means that they will grow up throughout their lifetime without not necessarily taking decisions that reflect that kind of values which you like to promote. So I wanted to bring that up because I think we are focusing a lot on higher education, but I think basic education is a fundamental building block.
Very glad that you did that. We have been talking very much in terms of education as quite instrumental, equipping people to be useful members of society, but perhaps forgetting that, especially in our report, we situate much of the sort of piece around education as a fundamental enabler of reconnecting and re-establishing a relationship with nature. It's another set of soft skills. and it's one that brings in also education as values as well. So I think really important. Jessica, I've got an additional question for you, but keep it in the back of your mind. Please answer this one about that we've been talking about skills and what the gap is and how to fill it. The question I wanted to ask actually is specifically related to around the investors, and how do we educate investors such that their choices are going to be more aligned with the transformation that's required. Others, feel free to keep that in the back of your mind as well. Jessica, please.
Thanks. So I mentioned two types of skills. One is digital skills. I was reading a report by IFC. So one report earlier said that the mobile broadband coverage across the world was at 90%. 90% of the population had broadband coverage. But then about 40% of the population that had broadband coverage had access issues. The 40% that have access issues are mostly in low and middle income countries. And so you can see the geographical distribution of these inequalities. Within that is another report that said that there will be a demand for digital skills, mostly in countries and regions that need transition to low emissions. And that's all countries, actually. In Africa particularly, there'll be about 230 million jobs across the continent that will need digital skills by 2030. This translates to about 650 million training opportunities and about 130 billion of markets for investments. But then different countries will have different levels of digital skills needs. And so, for example, very, very biased example here, Kenya will have a 50 to 55% need for digital skills, while Cote d'Ivoire will have a 35 to 45% need for digital skills. But then this means that there's need to integrate these digital skills development, both in the young population, but also in the existing population. And this means that it's not just in the energy production, because that's where we start kind of seeing just transitions, but also it's in the other sectors. And so it's not just in the, the usual ICT dominant sectors. It's in the water sector, it's in the agriculture sector, it's even in the education sector. And so these skills will help countries to not just be ready for transitions now, but also to actually implement them in time for 2050 and keep it that way, after 2050. Another area for skills is for investors and consumers. And we expect that investors are aware about what their money is doing. They are already informed before they invest. They know what the companies are doing, what they're likely to do, but also what their interests are. And so education here about smart choices, but also smart choices that benefit the economy, but also that benefit the planet is quite important. And that's in both the upcoming generation, but also the existing kind of older generation, where investors can be taught about what is good for the planet, what is good for themselves, but also what is good for the future. Another important area that I see here is consumers, which is a very, very kind of forgotten population. Consumers are mostly investors, they are consumers, but consumers are the young population. I was speaking at the Children's and Youth Pavilion on Wednesday, I think, and I was speaking to a young population and I was telling them, you're least likely to be an investor because you're just starting to work, but you're a consumer, mostly for the financial institutions. And so financially, I remember when I was young, we'd have the 18 to 25 or 18 to 35 bank accounts where you sold financial products that are specifically designed for younger populations. And so if we have a population that is educated, that has the skills to be critical about investments, but also about what their suppliers or what their companies do, then we have a population that is likely to drive investments and transitions towards low emissions. And I think this is something that we actually need to emphasize, where we start. It's something I'm now suddenly calling critical climate literacy. I don't know, it's probably a terrible term, but where younger populations are much more aware of what is good for them, but also they know their rights as consumers, and they can hold companies accountable against those expectations.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Love that last point, where you connect us back to this point about education empowers people to hold others to account. as well as equipping them to be, part of the change. Catherine, your example that you gave and the work that you do sounds like an amazing beacon. Is it just a beacon in a dark night? How do we scale up the sort of way that you are working across universities and perhaps even more widely than that? How do we get to scale?
That's a great question. I know that I've been to several panels where I've thought, wow, this is great research. I wish they had engaged a social scientist in some of this work so that they would better know how to work with the community, say if they were doing a restoration project. How do we expand the kind of, we call it extension model, where you have university experts that aren't just serving the students at the university, but their communities. And so we can do that globally. We can come to conferences like this and talk to this audience and say, look, this is a great opportunity and a model for you to share. There's a journal of extension. To what extent are there other opportunities to interact with universities at different international conferences to share that? We only have one other grant program internationally, and that's Korea has a Sea Grant program. And so I think it's one of education, use of social media, right? Going to where, in extension, you always go to where the people are, right? And so if we need financial people to learn and think a little bit differently about their job and about risk and about climate, we need to go to their conferences. We need to create, Cornell has virtual learning opportunities for professionals, and so we have sustainability curricula for engineers. We need to make sure it's there for financiers. We have low to no cost virtual education on climate science, on climate education. It's about access, and to the extent we can continue to provide access, we can continue to find the people that are the early adopters that will make the change is really important. And I really appreciated that comment about soft skills too, because it is so important to have the right people out in public, interacting with communities, speaking their language, understanding their values and what inspires them to action, because you need to find that little nugget of similar interests and help them see it's not just about climate, it's about biodiversity, it's about low-cost solutions to really complex problems.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We're going to round off our panel now. I know we've only just scratched the surface. What we have done, I think, is really illustrated the importance of education in all three of those eggs: the biosphere, reconnecting with nature; the society, in terms of equipping people for rapidly changing circumstances; and the economy as well, making sure that they can be part of the change and have a decent future. So, I really want to thank the panel for all of your insights today, and invite the audience to give you a round of applause, please. Before we show you a fantastic film that illustrates our report, we're going to take a quick family photo, please.
Hello. Yes. So, this was a very I'll request everybody to please clear the stage. We are going to now proceed with a short film presentation. This film is called The Portrait of a Silver Lining. This, I'll just wait for a minute, actually. All right. Rob, thank you so much for that panel moderation and to our speakers from the previous panel. Building on momentum and the ideas that we've touched upon, we now launch into panel number 2. But before we do that, to inject some energy and perspective of what we are really talking about and make it more interesting, we have a short film that was co-produced by CW and SAI for this project. This film is called Portrait of a Silver Lining, and for this performance artist, Mrs. Simar Singh, lent his art to convey this report in an audio-visual form. So I'll please request the IT team to play that film.
Ralph Emerson once said, "A house is made with walls and beams, but a home is built with love and dreams." The earth is not just a house, built with walls and beams and skyscrapers and malls and roads. The earth is our home, full of breathtaking forests and waterfalls, vast blue oceans and also malls, but with people and all kinds of different beings. The earth is filled with love and dreams, but our home is crumbling. Our dreams are breaking. We have changed ecosystems, made our home sick. Then we ignored the symptoms, waited for it to get tragic. In a world where nature is worshipped, actions don't match the words of the leadership. Rising emissions is a call for urgency, and now is the time for us to take agency, because families of our own swept away in floods. Yet we don't see pain till we see blood. While our forests shrink in front of our eyes, we renovate our home to where we cannot recognize. But 50 years ago, at Stockholm, an effort was made to save our home. 50 years later, there is no accountability, but it is time for us to take responsibility. Let's craft a key to unlock a better future and redefine our relationship with nature. Our home isn't perfect, but it doesn't need renovating. It needs compassion. Our home needs healing. It is already 2022, but there is hope. I see hope in the eyes of our generation as we are learning how to cope. Young voices are becoming an inspiration.
How dare you continue to look away?
Our home doesn't need heroes in capes or superheroes who change shapes. Our home needs people like you and me, people who act and people who make policies. We need to invest in a better future, reform finance and technology. We need to heal nature, build a world where all get prosperity, as this may be our last chance. This decade, our last window. Despite the clouds and the storm, there still can be a rainbow.
All right. So, with this, we are very happy to launch into the next segment of the event. But before that, just a quick thought. The film that you saw really instills the kind of emotion that underpins climate negotiations. We talk about detailed issues, from finance, technology to commas and paragraphs in a negotiation text. But ultimately, what it comes down to is the kind of life that we are living, the quality of life that we're giving to each other, and what we're leaving behind. With this, I'm very pleased to invite our next set of panelists to the stage. I'm very happy to invite Dr. Amy Moroforo from the Cambridge Zero University of Cambridge. Mr. Arun Patel, Director Climate at the Nand and Jeet Khemka Foundation. Mr. Axel Nordenstam from the Stockholm University. And last but not the least, Ms. Anisha Nazareth, Associate Scientist at the Stockholm Environment Institute, USA. My name is Prayang Jain, and I work at CW. I've been one of the lead authors of this report, and the reason why we're having this particular panel is because these voices often do not get out. The objective for this particular panel is that when we talk about youth and youth action, the first picture that comes to all of our minds are the youth who are outside protesting, trying to make a career in climate, or raising issues or coming up with solutions. But it is actually, in my personal perspective, that we need to pay a lot of attention to the youth who are in the room, around the table, and trying to make a change. And of course, the people who we had in the previous panel are all people who've been there. But it is this particular generation, the people on the stage right now, including myself, who've benefited from the climate movement, right? So the objective of this panel is to actually touch on the success stories of some of these people, highlight the work they're doing, discuss challenges, and bridge that next path that we need to walk on. So with this, I'm very pleased to ask the opening question to all panelists, one by one, just like Rob continued. What is the issue that you work on? One challenge that you're trying to address, and that one thing that you feel 30 years down the line, let's say, we'll be better at. So the core of your work, the issues that you focus, and that vision point that motivates and guides you.
Thank you very much. So to kick us off with this, the issue that I work on, so I work at the University of Cambridge, and I focus on climate education and students' engagement in climate there. In terms of an issue that I face, I think one theme that I've really found coming up repeatedly over the conversations I've been having at this conference in the education space is not a lack of willingness to transform. I think we all know that young people, and in fact everybody, needs the skills, both soft and hard, to be able to affect a net zero transition. I think the struggle that I see at the moment is how do we bring together all of the thinking and all of the thought leadership in a way that actually takes it from that intellectual space and brings it to where education actually happens. And that might be, for example, in the academics at Cambridge, going, okay, how does your subject, I don't know, history relate to this? And obviously it relates, but making sure that gets to the students there. That's a very local example, but also thinking about, okay, actually how do we take the knowledge that, say, for example, on climate solutions, the research that's happening on climate solutions, and bring that to young people in schools internationally so they can know that they might have a career in something that they had never thought of before and that might actually be able to solve that problem. I think I'm going to stop there because I've been talking for a bit and hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Prayang. Thank you to CEW and SEI for hosting this panel and inviting me. I'm actually going to take the order slightly differently. In terms of the challenge that we're looking at, there's a lot of talk in the world right now about being in a moment of polycrisis, but I feel there's a polycrisis in education which we're not paying as much attention to. The first issue of the enduring challenges of lockdowns and school closures, which has a huge impact on productivity and GDP. 6 months of school closures lead to 1.5% reduction in annual GDP over the course of a century, 3% reduction in lifetime earnings of an individual. That's 6 months. 290 million students in India went through 2 years of school closures. So we can only begin to sort of think about the compounding impacts of that. The second challenge is that of just growing up with climate anxiety and a sense of dread, the mental health challenges that hold us back from thriving. And the third, of course, is localized impacts. Air pollution in Delhi, forest fires in the Pacific Northwest, so many other challenges that are sort of disrupting children's education systems. So when we think about how to respond to this, I think there are two key principles that are important. One is to sort of not narrowly frame this as a technical issue. I think we can't be making the same mistake that, for example, the tech industry has made, thinking that engineers and coders are going to build a better world through digital platforms and basically just end up selling ads. Rather, as we build the climate economy and bring in new people into this economy, we have to be embedding these technologies in society. And the second is, of course, as Arunabha mentioned, the empathy issue. We must be thinking about an empathic flourishing, about social and emotional skills. So I don't want to take up too much more time, so I'll come to what I work on and solutions later, but I think this framing of the polycrisis in education in this moment of climate impacts is particularly important.
That's a great point. My name is Axel Nordenstam from Sweden. So I see things from more of an international relations perspective, since I'm doing a PhD on that at the moment, and also I'm also active in the think tank sector. And I have a specific interest when being here is understanding the different diversities of addressing the crisis, because what we are seeing here is an opportunity to co-create the future. So when talking about the green transitions, I'm walking around and thinking that we can actually talk much more to each other, and I hope that we will have these conversations also outside of COP. There's a huge opportunity for us here to continue these conversations also outside of this venue. So I think that this is my quick intervention now, and then we can also talk about different ways of addressing this. Right. Thanks.
Hi, thank you, Fran. I'm Anisha. I work for the Stockholm Environment Institute. And the bulk of my research is on the interactions between climate and systemic inequalities. So we know, of course, that the climate crisis increases vulnerabilities and increases inequality all over the world, but also there's increasing research that the climate crisis is a result of systemic inequalities between the global north and the global south, but also inequalities within countries. And so in that sense, I think a major challenge that I see is that so often climate mitigation solutions and solutions for the inequality crisis are discussed very separately, and they end up perpetuating inequities rather than resolving them. And so you have either people in positions of power who then benefit from climate mitigation solutions rather than climate mitigation solutions that really shift power to those who are most vulnerable. And without actually solving since the climate crisis is caused so much by different systemic inequalities, we need to question whether we can actually solve it without tackling other inequalities.
All right. So that's a fantastic opening to the discussion here. We've talked about applied learning and how you can open new pathways. We've spoken about the poly crisis and the impact COVID has had on local education, the first block of learning, and the need to build bridges. At the same time, building the increasing inequalities and its impact. Now, in this larger context that the speakers have themselves set, what is the role of young people? That is my principal question to you here. What do you think the young generation can achieve with its actions, and where do we stand right now? Is there a low-hanging fruit that is yet to be, plucked? We look at systemic challenges, but what is the role of young people in this situation? And this is where I encourage all of you to delve into your work. I know, Arav, you've done work with indigenous communities. Amy, you have a doctorate in some biology. And Axel, you've been working in different countries. Anisha, you've also worked in different countries and on scientific issues. So what is the role of young people here, and how are you trying to address this landscape and navigate this? Because I understand it is not easy to solve all of this right now at this stage of our careers. But where are you right now in that space?
Thank you. I think this point is fundamental because young people, without being too obvious, are the future. That being said, I think there's a really important point to be made before I say anything else, that I don't think all of the responsibility for this should be lumped onto young people. They obviously need the skills, they need to take action. They have a share of responsibility because it is the future of their lives, and the quality of their lives is going to depend upon some of the actions they take. But I think fundamentally, anything that young people do has to be with the support of older generations who've already had the opportunity to lead full lives and gain the skills that they might need to address this problem already. That's the first point I was going to make. The second point is to really focus on some of my own work. So I work at the University of Cambridge, and a lot of the work that we do is with our own students. We have a number of programs that we run that are very intentionally designed to think systemically about these as issues. We're not telling students to just turn off the lights and put on a jumper. Obviously, that's important too. But really what we want them to think about is what are their values? What are things that they personally really care about that they can drive action on throughout their lives? So we have programs that do things like asking them to go and make a sustainable change happen in their accommodation, but systemically. So going and talking to the laundry staff or the cooks about the food that's being made and seeing what that change is and enabling them to have that power and action in the world, alongside giving them some training and workshops around things like working out who your stakeholders are, even if that is working out that you need to talk to the cook, and then applying that set of thinking skills to broader problems later on in their careers. We also have a number of programs that do things like looking at a very, very early stage entrepreneurship for students. So trying to open up entrepreneurship by doing very light touch entrepreneurship competitions where we try and get unconventional entrepreneurs, unconventional young people who are not people who normally do entrepreneurship into thinking about climate problems by supporting them, again, giving them some skills and some workshops that don't completely interrupt with their studies, but enable and empower them to go and make a difference in this space. I have many more examples, but I would love to hear about some of the other work that you guys have been doing. So I'm going to hand over to you now, but I'm very happy to pick up this conversation in more depth.
Thank you. I want to echo your point about not putting all of the onus on young people. I think we need to redesign these systems altogether, particularly the education system hasn't changed very much since the Industrial Revolution. Fundamentally, kids come in to a school which resembles in many ways a factory. A bell rings, arbitrarily they're supposed to code switch and move on to a new subject. There's not enough integration. There's a lot of siloed sort of learning and not enough interdisciplinary thinking that's seeded in the system itself. And that we can delve into in more detail. But in terms of the work that I do, in addition to full-time working in climate philanthropy with the Nandanjeet Khemka Foundation, I'm also co-founder of an organization called Earth Focus Foundation, which works with forest-dwelling communities in central India around a national park called Kanha. And what we do is we work on large-scale landscape restoration and also nature-based education through a contextual curriculum that we're building. And the focus there is on taking essentially these siloed chunks and bringing them together. How do we tap into the local knowledge, which is so neglected? How do we bring in tribal elders when children are learning about the forest economy, which 300 million people in India directly depend upon? And how do we also find new ways of empowering the youth in that context to achieve the kind of leapfrogging that we believe is possible? Arunabha earlier showed a quadrant with biophysical boundaries. The northeast quadrant may create a lot of research and development, but it's fundamentally in the southwest quadrant where the chance for leapfrogging is possible. And that's where I think those most on the margins of our current development paradigm, if they can build new equitable paradigms that sort of bring people and nature together, that's where I see a lot of hope.
Good point, good point. So when it comes to learning and education, I think it's important to think about it in terms of formal and informal learning, just as the previous panel emphasized, that you gain some skills at universities and in the global education system, but some others at extracurriculars or in the NGO sector and the civil society. And I think my work so far really reflects that. I have one with my PhD is surely on the formal educational side, but on the other side of things, there I have many years of experience, both from co-founding a think tank in Sweden when I was 19 years old, that then became more of a political school for young people who were interested in politics. So some of the young politicians that you see in Sweden at the moment were basically part of that movement, towards then being part of another organization that where I served as president, which gathered political science students in Sweden, and then also a global organization for a student body comprised by political science students, actually comprised by a number of students from 70 countries. And truth be told, I would never be able to engage in those kinds of conversations without the skills that I have acquired in both the formal and informal sector. So when reforming the global educational system, that I really hope that we will have a global perspective here, that it's not going to be national reforms, but actually a global opportunity here, because what we are seeing, especially with the global climate crisis, is that it's an intergenerational opportunity, but also an intergenerational challenge and an intergenerational responsibility. So we need to tackle this together across generations, and the only way to do it is to keep on the dialogue, to keep on this conversation, and actually do this together. So I'm looking forward to many more chats.
Thank you. So in terms of what young people should be doing and can be doing, I think something that young people have been doing extremely well, for example, is really confronting more of these power imbalances and grappling with their own privilege and making that part of the broader climate narrative. And something that we're doing at SEI, for example, is we have a team of young female researchers working across all our centers that's involved in conducting research on how to shift power through climate research. So how do we conduct research that where the way in which we conduct research and the research questions that we raise really very consciously try to bridge divides between the global north and global south, and then also tackle inequalities within countries. So that's just one example of ways in which even within the research community, young people can then think about, using their own privilege and position to bridge some of these broader systemic inequalities without it being, something that's an unattainable thing to tackle immediately.
All right, this is really helpful. We've gotten to know about a variety of things which I will not summarize. We are running low on time. But talking about narratives, about soft and hard skills, and the changing paradigm of education and how we have to educate and train ourselves, I want to slightly shift the conversation to sustainable lifestyles. Because as much as we talk about macroeconomic changes, it is that behavioral nudge that is required across the world, not disregarding the disparity that exists between the kind of facilities a country within a country, like the rich and the poor have. Now, for our generation, I'm really putting you on spot here because you are the representatives of the young generation on the panel, and you're very good representatives. Not all of us may be that conscious about the climate, but in adopting a sustainable lifestyles and leading with it, not forgetting that we are also spoilt by the choices and the industrialization and the consumptuous nature of our lives. Where do you think is that massive major nudge in education, in learning, and as young people grow and professionalize, both in universities and outside of it, to adopt sustainable lifestyles so that it becomes the accepted and the expected normal behavior? And that's a massive challenge, and I do not think that it is on anybody but us for us to solve it, because we are representing those outside the room and inside the room.
Sure, I can start. I think when it comes to sustainable behavior, I do think that, yes, as young people, we should be making sustainable choices, but we also need to start thinking about how we make sustainable choices accessible and attainable. Because, and I'll just give a personal example in this case. One of my professors told me once that it's all very well to say make sustainable choices, but I'm in a grocery store with a screaming baby, I'm just picking whatever's available. And I think that's something to keep in mind, because we are all, when we're making sustainable choices, we are fighting against people who are currently who benefit from the status quo, who benefit from people making unsustainable choices and put a great deal of money and power into making sure our grocery store shelves are arranged in a way that encourage unsustainable consumerism. And so I think what we can do, because we are in a position to make sustainable choices, and we have that privilege and perhaps the time privilege and the privilege of being maybe from the global north and that sort of thing, is raise awareness about those kinds of things, challenge grocery stores that put unsustainable stuff on the shelves first and the sustainable stuff behind, speak out when we see these kind of imbalances so that we make sustainable choices more attainable for people who maybe don't have those privileges.
Right, so Anisha has taken the fight to the grocery stores. Axel, what about you?
I think the fight is also to create a global movement that is making people so aware about the global crisis that we are facing and the importance of our choices, both individual choices but also structural choices, the way we actually form our global system. And if more and more people would talk about that and actually care and put that as a priority point, exactly in the same way as peace was a priority after the Second World War, then we are in the right directions. But there's far there, we must mobilize and must continue.
Thank you. So my thinking on this is twofold. On the one hand, of course, all of the individual changes in our own lifestyles, in our own behaviors, the aggregate impact of which will make a huge difference, particularly on issues like plastic and waste management and so on. But I think the second and almost more important point is to delve into the complexity of the societal transformation that will enable a complete green transformation. According to the IPCC, there's 40 to 70% of emissions reductions that can be achieved through demand-side management. We need to strive for a lot of abundance and equity, but at the same time be preparing the next generation to deal in a lot of trade-offs and negotiations, and those sorts of technical and also complex societal challenges that will enable the huge shift in emissions that we need.
I have so much to say on this. Anisha, I think your opening point was fabulous. I think that fundamentally we need to be changing systems to make the sustainable choice the easy one, and that enables everything else. I think there's another broader point to be made, though, about this, which is why do people make choices at all? And we can make different choices when we are educated and we have exposure to new ideas. But most people want to live lives that they find satisfying, lives that they take joy from. So I think we also need to frame sustainable choices as ones that we can personally live really good lives doing. We can love our families, we can do the things that we can enjoy as far as we can in a world that's going to look dramatically different. We know the world is going to be really, really changeable in the future. So when we come back to education and educational nudges, one of the things that I really believe is important is preparing young people and indeed everybody to be able to be creatively resilient in the face of all of those changes. I'm going to stop there.
All right. That is great. Thank you so much. We are running close to time. So at the moment, as we close, one line key thought. For example, we are at COP27 right now. At COP35, 7 years from now, what is that one challenge that you think we would have made significant progress on? I'm not talking about the negotiations agenda, but the role of you young people and the challenges you see in your daily life. It could be the alignment of stuff at grocery stores, or it could be how education is more accessible, or perhaps how are universities and different systems interacting and building bridges. Quick one-line statements, and that will be the ending of the panel. We have a very exciting film afterwards to show. Yeah.
In 7 years. In 7 years, okay.
Yeah.
It's really hard. I hope that we will have been able to expand current educational policy to have a future-looking lens that enables young people to get the education they need for a world that's going to look very different. So I think we need educational policy at a global scale to reflect the realities that we are living.
I'd love to see education systems that intervene for migrant and refugee children and allow them to land on their feet and thrive due to the increasing displacement that we're seeing within countries for now and potentially between countries in the future.
I would love that we come here to COP. Well, ideally we wouldn't come to COP because the problem would have been solved, to be frank. But ideally when returning, I hope that we will find many more co-created solutions, co-created across boundaries, across nations, across continents, and that we actually have something to be proud of when we return here to 35. So it's more, so we have some hope to look forward to, and I think this is where young people come into the picture primarily, that we can actually bring some hope to the table. We will keep people accountable, but we can actually also be part of the solution.
Yes, so my hope would be that we are talking in 2035, we're talking about climate solutions that are much more intersectional, much more interdisciplinary. There's much more focus on the social sciences and much more input from people from different communities, that COP has become much more accessible to people to whom it's not accessible currently.
All right. This is great. In front of me, I have a grid of problems and solutions. All we need to do is now thread them together. At this moment, I would like to thank our panelists and the audience for listening to our ideas and thoughts and gather together for a photo op with the Stockholm+50 report that has been written to advocate and realize the common vision we hold. The session has not yet come to an end. We will need about a minute more at the IT end to solve for some limited elements to play a short film from a project called Faces of Climate Resilience that CW has pioneered in the past 1 year. Right. Come. So I invite my colleague, Mr. Milan Jacob, to please come and talk about the project and highlight why these films are relevant at COP27 and
अगर स्रोत है तो जीवन है, नहीं तो कुछ नहीं है.
Hi, thanks Priyank. So I'll just quickly take a minute. So the film you're seeing here is called The Young Water Scientist. It resonates very much, with the discussion we just had. It's about two youngsters who are, helping in climate adaptation by restoring springs in this Indian state of Uttarakhand, which is increasingly, becoming drought-prone because of forest fires and other elements of climate change. So it's a part of a larger series of films we've done called The Faces of Climate Resilience, where we've captured the voices of climate vulnerable people from different parts of India. But we've highlighted how communities are adapting and responding to the crisis rather than just focusing on loss and damage. So you can see one of the examples here. And please do check out the other films as well, which is available on our website and on our YouTube channel. So yeah, can we please have the film? Thank you.
स्प्रिंग हमारे यहाँ के लोगों के लिए बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट है, इसीलिए चाहते हैं कि हमारे स्रोत कभी ना सूखे. अगर स्रोत है तो जीवन है, नहीं तो कुछ नहीं है. मेरा नाम हीरा संमल है और मैं शूरा गांव से हूँ और मेरी 21 है. मैंने इंटर किया. स्प्रिंग पत्थर और मिट्टी के में जो जमाव पानी होता है, भूजल भंडारण, वो जमीन के अंदर ही होता है और एक्टिफा बोलते हैं उसको. उसी से पानी मतलब जो बाहर से वो अपना रास्ता बनाता है. हमारी जो पहाड़ की लाइफ है वो ज़्यादातर स्रोत पे डिपेंड करती है, क्योंकि यहाँ पर स्रोत के अलावा और कुछ ऐसी चीज़ें हैं नहीं जिससे कि हम पानी ले सकें. या नदियाँ हैं, कुएँ हैं, ये चीज़ें तो यहाँ पर नहीं है. पहले जब हम छोटे तब देखते थे कि बारिश बहुत हल्की बढ़िया बारिश होती थी, एकदम हल्की हल्की से, और वो जिसकी ज़मीन के अंदर थी, जिससे कि हमारे स्रोतों का डिस्चार्ज बढ़ता था. आजकल ऐसा हो रहा है कि एकदम जोर से बारिश होती है, मतलब वो जमीन अपने अंदर सोख ही नहीं पाती, गिरते गिरते इतनी तेज होती है कि बह जाता है पानी, और एकदम से तेज होती है और एकदम भी बंद हो जाती है. ये कि उसका कैचमेंट एरिया ही उसको मतलब रिचार्ज कर सकता है। मेन तो ये है, जो स्रोत गर्मी में सूख जाते हैं, ये मौसमी स्रोत होते हैं, तो इनको रिचार्ज करने के लिए हमको इसके कैचमेंट एरिया में भूगर्भीय सर्वे होता है, जब उसके आधार पर हमको इसके कैचमेंट एरिया में काम करना होता है। पहले हमारे यहाँ एक जल उपभोक्ता समिति गठित हुई, मतलब लोगों ने ही चुना, लोगों को 7-8 लोगों की समिति बनी, जो मतलब वहाँ के लाभार्थी थे स्रोत के। समिति ने मुझे एक KRP के रूप में चुना, जिससे कि मैं 3 स्रोतों का डिस्चार्ज लेती हूँ अपने गाँव में। और फिर उसके बाद भूगर्भीय सर्वे हुई कैचमेंट एरिया में कि कहाँ पे क्या काम होगा।
10,000 गड्ढे हैं, ये 500 लीटर तक वाटर अपने अंदर एब्जॉर्ब कर सकते हैं। और ये बहुत सारे बने हैं इधर, जो कैचमेंट एरिया हमारे बहुत सारे बने हैं।
तब हमने यहाँ पे एक DRP बनाया गया है, जिसमें कि 60 सेंटीमीटर में नीचे से पत्थर भरे जाते हैं और ऊपर से 40 सेंटीमीटर में मिट्टी भरी जाती है। इसमें ये माना गया कि इसमें 1000 लीटर पानी आ सकता है, हमारे स्रोत को डिस्चार्ज करने में हमारा काम आता है। तो पहले 2, 3, 4 उसका LPM था, तो आज की डेट में देखें जब काम हुआ है तो उसका 8, 10 ऐसे है। तो जैसे हमको सिखाया गया, उसके बाद हम स्कूल में बच्चों को भी सिखाते हैं, प्रैक्टिकल करके सिखाते हैं। एक मॉडल लेके आते हैं और उसमें बताते हैं कि टोपोग्राफी होती है, उसमें पेड़ पौधे अगर अधिक ना हो तो पानी सीधे ऊपर की सतह से रह जाता है। अगर वहाँ पे हम काम मतलब पेड़ ज़्यादा लगाएं और वहाँ पे हम ये PPT वगैरह बना दें तो हमारा पानी मतलब रुक सकता है। स्रोत है मतलब वो ज़्यादा लंबे समय तक हमको पानी दे सकता है। अगर हम पानी को अगर बरकरार रखना चाहते हैं तो उसके हमको मतलब युवा पीढ़ी को एकत्रित करके ये बताना पड़ेगा कि हमारे लिए पानी अगर मेन है, हम नहीं चाहते कि हमारे गांव से कोई बाहर जाए, हमको स्रोत का मेन ध्यान रखना पड़ेगा।